In this module, we're going to discuss conducting research. So one of the first things to know about empirical research and non-empirical research. Empirical research is based on observation and measurements of a phenomenon, all right? So directly experienced by the researcher. So it begins in that same way of the way that you've begun with your own research. There's something that you have observed. There's something that you're interested in that you'd like to measure and understand. With empirical research, though, it relies on the data that's derived from the actual observation or experimentation. So you observed a phenomenon, but now what you want to do is you're going to use the empirical research format and science to actually determine if your observation, your hypothesis, your belief is correct. So empirical research is what you typically will see when looking at peer-reviewed journals, and what you probably have seen as you're beginning your literature review. So you have your introduction or literature review, and so that's looking at what's known about the topic, the theoretical framework, discussing previous studies, then going into methodology, which is really the key part of the empirical research model, which is your research design. So how was the study created, and could it be recreated? Is it what was the population? What were the variables being researched? What was the research process, and what were the measures used to try and capture this phenomenon? Then we look at the results. What was learned from the study? So based on the research design and using statistically validated models and a population and going through all the checks and balances to ensure that the research is properly designed, then you look at the results of the research using your statistical data. Or you're looking at quotations from research participants if it was a qualitative study. And with all of that data, then that leads into your discussion, which is the conclusion, the implications of the study. So why was the study important? What did you learn? Was your hypothesis supported? What can the results tell us about the field of study? And what are the suggestions for future research? So it's based on actual scientific process of being able to observe a phenomenon that captures your interest. So you form a hypothesis, and then you decide that you're going to use this scientific method to be able to prove or disprove your hypothesis. And it's based on this scientifically best practice for research design and methodology and statistics results, and then present it in a way that others can read and build upon. With non-empirical research, it may also be something that it was observed, but rather than use the scientific process to prove or disprove a hypothesis, non-empirical research tends to do a more comprehensive review of existing research. So, for example, if you just did a literature review and didn't actually do the scientific using measures and statistics and things like that, you may find yourself doing more of non-empirical research. So an example could be somebody who is completing a dissertation for a PhD in historical theory. So that can include non-empirical research because it's going back, it's a comprehensive review of existing articles and theories that are out there to promote a new theory. But in terms of actual science or manipulation, or when we talk about different types of empirical research, there's not experimentation being done, but it is still extensive research. Interestingly enough, Freud was primarily a non-empirical researcher. He did not use much in the way of scientific methods, certainly not as we know them now. He more or less observed the world around him and with his clients and in his life experience, and then used that to further his research and his beliefs. And so even as prolific as someone like Freud, actually did not use a research-based theoretical approach to his work. So interestingly enough, that probably if Freud was trying to prove his theories today, he would likely not be accepted into a peer-reviewed journal. So nowadays, we want to make sure that that there is a scientific method used when publishing research more often than not, because that's where we get into the science of psychology. When we talk about psychology being a science, because there is data, because it should be a phenomenon should be captured and should be able to be repeated to know, all right, this is something that causes happiness, or this is something that can have that's cause a negative reaction, or so I sometimes you'll see studies that are done over and over to see how they change. So repeat studies to see are they getting the same results, and why when we talk about sampling, why we choose a certain sample population or sample size, because what we're looking for is to be able to use empirical data and empirical research to prove what is actually a scientific hypothesis about the human condition and human nature. And so this is why we use empirical research. So it is considered to be actual science. This is the science aspect of psychology and of research. It avoids confirmation bias. So it's where when we recall information, we may interpret things differently. So if we took all of our theories of the world and all the things that we observe and presented them as fact, then it would be very hard to possibly prove and apply to a general population, because we may recall things differently, we may interpret things differently. And so our own opinions are not something that we can consider to be scientifically valid as part of the human condition, and not until it's scientifically proven. It avoids things like the availability bias. So for someone like Freud, all of his theories were based on people that he had access to. So people that he was seeing or treating. It was not go around and interview the general population about his theories very much, or apply them to different cultures, or look much of what we would call the scientific empirical process. So so we want to, when we're using empirical research, that's why we look at sampling and sampling population to make sure that we are avoiding the availability bias. And then a result of poorly designed research, what we're ultimately trying to avoid is misleading results and poor interpretations. By using empirical research and using the science and psychology, we're able to make better predictions, make better facts about the way that we believe the scientific approach to the human condition being. And so this is why, saying the age of the internet, peer review and empirical research is very important, because it's very easy to go online, write a blog that is based on someone's observation of the world. And yes, that may resonate, but is it scientifically proven? Is it science because somebody writes it down? The reason why this empirical research methodology has been used, why we have peer review, is also that we can have a way of pointing to science and saying, this is based on fact, this is based on numbers, this is based on a statistical analysis. The data or the study can be repeated. This is why when you select a method, you want to make sure that it has been statistically validated, because it's gone through a rigorous testing procedure to make sure that it is measuring what it says it measures. So more often than not, you want to rely on your empirical research to be able to support the studies that you're doing. And so this slide that you've seen from previous weeks, as you're doing this with your own research of why to observe. So you selected something that has led you to your own research topic, and now you have to determine how you'll observe it. And this is where you begin collecting the measures. And so you want to make sure that they are statistically reliable. They have been validated, that they do measure what they say they will measure. You're determining when to observe. Is there a timeline for the research? What's the process? Is there an order to the measures? If you're using multiple measures, in order to when you'll be giving them? Will it be over a period of time and use longitudinal research, or can it be done in one sitting? And then importantly, of course, is who to observe. So who will participate in your study? Will it be an entire population or a sample of your population? Sometimes you can also use what is convenience sampling. And actually one of your peers in the program recently received a publication and for some security research, and they made it clear that they used convenience sampling of college students from 2 different universities. And so they acknowledged, yes, it was a convenience sampling because that was what they had available to them. So ethically, we want to be upfront and say, yes, this is what was available. We used different universities. We looked at, we tried to keep the sample as broad as possible, but we're taking the data found with these university students and attempting to apply this to the general population. And so you want to be able to write about that. So who's participated in your study? Is it prone to sampling bias because that's what's available? So if you're using availability sample, then you want to be upfront and clear about that, as we talked about during ethics, that that is something that you participate in your study. Well, sometimes it's the people that are available to you, and you do your best efforts to try and make it applicable to the population that you're aiming towards, but you want to be upfront about who will participate in your study and why. So these terms you may be familiar with when doing empirical research: qualitative and quantitative research. And the way that most remember is that quantitative primarily uses numbers. So those are your questionnaires, your data-driven, inductive reasoning, using a lot of the scientific methods. The qualitative research uses words. And so these are like the focus groups, your interviews, you're looking for very broad generalizations of themes and concepts. So for example, you could ask somebody on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling today? And so they may say 7. That's it. Just circle the 7. And so now you've got an idea of, okay, so 10 is the highest, then 7, they're doing pretty good. Or if you sit down with somebody and you say, how are you feeling today? And rather than just saying, that's 7, you're going, well, today was a good day. I got an A on my paper, but then my sibling and I got into an argument, and you're filling in a lot of the gray areas of research, because some of these questionnaires and the data driven, and when we talk about variables, see that there's different ways to capture this data, but it is based on numbers, whereas something like a focus group or an interview, a lot of times you can get much more in-depth information, much richer and more specific information to what you're looking for. So as a result of the level of detail and effort spent doing qualitative research, you may use a smaller, more specific sample set, whereas quantitative data can be larger and much more random. So an example, it was actually a mixed method study that I participated in, but it started off with the qualitative data. And so what we did, we conducted 10 different interviews, and from those interviews, we had to transcribe every single word and then go through the piles and piles of papers to look. And every time there was a specific word used, circled it, and then look to see how many times that word was used. So as you can imagine, it was a fairly long and arduous process, as opposed to say a quantitative survey, which probably could have captured it, loaded into a general form, and then just done a statistical analysis on. So it tends to be a lot of a larger, more random sample set, just because of the ease of collecting data when you're doing quantitative research. So more often than not, quantitative studies tend to be more popular, also because it's easier to get the measures that are statistically validated and reliable, whereas qualitative, you may have to find studies that have asked very specific questions, and then you have to be very careful about the wording that you use. And so the qualitative research is a little bit more in the gray area, which sometimes has the richest information, especially if it's a pilot study or you're just beginning to explore, to look for a theory or look for information. So we have our experimental research, which is a type of empirical research. So with experimental research, you are doing an experiment, just as the name implies. So you're introducing a specific variable, maybe a treatment or a measurable change, and then you're looking to see if there's an impact. So an example that I'm giving here is, say a researcher wants to explore the relationship between video games and aggression. So you have this episode of 90 children between the ages of 5 and 7. Prior to playing any video games, they give the child an assessment on their current aggression level. They then randomly break the children into 3 different groups. One is given a violent video game, one is given a non-violent puzzle game, and then the other is not given any video game. Then afterwards, the groups are then into one group and assess the level of aggression to see if the video game had any impact on aggression levels. And then in this scenario, the group that did not play the video games is what we're referred to as a control group, because no treatment was given. So you're looking to see, do video games impact aggression level? So first we need to see, okay, what was the impact the violent game had? What was the impact of the non-violent game? Now, what if we just didn't have a game at all? So and that's your control group, because otherwise, it could just, you would look at a non-violent or a violent game, but it could just be the act of playing a game itself. So the control group is one that has not been impacted at all. And so that's kind of your base level to start from. And that's your control group. Non-empirical research, it's also, non-experimental research is a type of empirical research, but you're not introducing a treatment or a variable. You're not really changing anything in the experience. This may be a survey, a poll, questionnaire, or an observation of a moment in time. And so this is when we ask the question of, when do you want to capture this data? So are you looking for something that's an attitude or a belief or behavior of a population at that given moment? So you may get a feedback survey. Do you like this? Did you enjoy this movie? The end of the semester, you're given a survey on your course experience. So it is still conducting data, it is still getting research, but it's looking to see what a descriptive, how you would describe something, how you observe something, what your attitude, your belief is, as opposed to manipulating the variable to see if it has an impact on you. So for example, actually using the course room as an example, by the end of the class, you will fill out your assessment of the course, and it captures your attitude and your belief. Now, if on the back end, we are not doing this, I promise, we had 2 classes and we wanted to introduce, deliberately introduce one that was very chaotic and one that was very ordered and used notes and words and Blackboard, and then the other was just a simple YouTube video, right? And so then we would look to see, okay, what did people say before? What did they say after? And there would be some manipulation, some experiment being done that's deliberate, as opposed to just capturing the actual attitude or assessment in a much more natural and organic way. So that clarifies the difference between running an experiment and not running an experiment. When doing an experiment, what we're looking for, we have the word of variables, okay? And that's the trait or characteristic that can vary within a population. So your independent variables, that is the item that's being manipulated and the variable whose effect is being studied. The dependent variable is the item that can change in response to the manipulation of the independent variable. So in our aggression and video game example, aggression would be the dependent variable, where the video game use would be the independent variable. So we're looking at, if you to look at the image here, the independent variable. Did it influence or change the dependent variable? So the independent variable being video games, did video games influence or change aggression? So it's not if we switched it and said, do students who test or children who test high in aggression choose different types of video games, right? That would change things. In the way that the study was worded, in the example that I gave, what is the item that is being changed? Okay, so when you go to look to your own studies, this is something that I want you to be able to do for your research and say, what is the variable that is going to influence or change the dependent variable? So is social media going to influence women in self-image? And so then you're looking at, well, is it type of social media? So the independent variable would then be the type of social media, while the dependent variable would be self-perception. Okay, so I'll just think about this image when you're doing your own study, because you will absolutely need to flesh out what your independent variables and dependent variables are, because then that's how you know exactly what to use to go and find an assessment method for. So if I said, all right, I want to look at aggression as my independent, as aggression as my dependent variable, and video game use as my independent variable. Now I know, all right, so I need to go and find an assessment that will measure aggression in children. And then I need to go and find and design a study with video game examples, and what will that look like? And so now I've got a direction that I need to go in. But knowing your variables is one of the key cornerstones of
beginning the methodology for your research, because that's how you determine what it is that your hypothesis is. So even when you design your hypothesis is how that independent variable will change the dependent variable. So your hypothesis may be, I believe that children playing aggressive video games or violent video games will show an increase in aggression. And so that's your hypothesis. And now you design this study to go and test it. So I want to stress knowing your independent and dependent variables. If you have any questions about that with your study, please do not hesitate to reach out and we can talk it out and help you find a method that will help you with your research design and capturing the variables that you want to study through your experiment. Okay. So all experimental studies, there has to be at least one independent variable and one dependent variable, because your hypothesis is the extent to which one impacts the other. Some studies do have more than one independent variable. And again, it can make for richer data, but it requires more care in the research design, because the more factors that you're bringing in, now you have to make sure that they're not influencing each other. So you have to be very careful with the random sampling, the organization of the data collection, your statistical analyses. So usually studies don't have more than one or two independent variables, just because it can be very hard to keep them apart. So if in addition to aggression, or measuring aggression, I was looking at video games, and then I also wanted to look at the color of the paint on the wall, right? So those would be things that I would be changing, but now I'm mixing things up, because is the increase in aggression due to the change in the color of the paint, or is it due to the video game? So I had to be very, very careful in how I design my research to be able to make sure that I can note when the change or when something was influenced and by which independent variable. And there's a whole bevy of statistical analysis that can be done for that. We're not going to be getting deep into statistics in this course, but for now, you need to know that yes, we can have more than one independent variable, but we do try and keep it simpler, just for it's easier to capture. It's an easier thing to capture of the way that one variable impacts another, as opposed to introducing other variables that can muddy the waters. So again, independent variable, it's being manipulated. It's what is being, the effect that's being studied. It's the stimulus, it's the input, it's what being changed. The dependent variable, it's the response to the independent variable, it's the output. So again, in the study, if you wanted to measure the impact of frequency on social media and depression, what's the independent variable and what's the dependent variable? So in this, the frequency of social media and depression, we would be looking at frequency of social media as the independent variable, because we're looking at depression. Right, so when we look at variables, now we get even deeper where we're begin splitting into types of variables, right? So we know, all right, we've got our independent and our dependent variables, but how do we study those? What questions do we ask when we're looking at our quantitative research? And these are the main types of variables, right? So you've got your interval and ratio, right? So this is where there are categories where there can be distances. So an example of the interval or ratio of how old are you? So you can see it in years, and sometimes you see this when you fill things out. I am 35 to 40, 40 to 45. So spaced into distances that can be identical across the range, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, 15 to 20. Where do you fit? What interval do you fit into, and how old are you? Ordinal. So these can be ranked. How frequently do you check the price of Bitcoin? So if you do it every day, if you do it once a week. If you've ever had a depression questionnaire from your doctor and they say, how often do you feel sad? How often do you have suicidal ideation? Once a month, monthly. So that's one way of collecting information. You can do nominal or categorical. right? And so this isn't a preference. This isn't I do this more than others. This is what's your favorite currency? Okay, I like the yen. I like the US dollar. I like the British pound. You're making a selection. So you're selecting a particular category. And then dichotomous, and what's interesting about this is, so this is traditionally we would say, are you male or female? Right? What's now in modern, go forward, this is not being a dichotomous variable anymore. So we may find that it could become nominal. So which gender do you identify with? And so you select one. It could be an integral or a ratio. To what degree do you identify as male or female? There's inventories that assess that. For example, if you're familiar with the Sandra Ben and her work, she always looked at gender in an integral and ratio and a sliding scale. So on a scale of 1 to 100, how far with one gender do you identify with? So when you're doing your variables and when you're, if you do write a questionnaire or you do come across your measures, you want to be looking at this because you want to be structuring your questions so that they're fitting into traditional measures of variables in social science research. So knowing these types, integral, ordinal, nominal, or categorical, and then dichotomous, these are often ways that we capture information. We'll get into the types like Likert scales and things like that later, but just knowing that at a very high level, these are types of variables that we can, ways of capturing the information in our research. Important terms that you'll come across. So unit of analysis, who's being studied, it's often a person. The target population, that's the population the researcher wants to generalize the results to. So researcher wants to conduct a study on the relationship between depression and internet use. May use college students as the unit of analysis because they're accessible. But they make their target population male and female between the ages of 18 and 22. So not all male and females are obviously college students, but because that is what is accessible, they've done a convenient sampling of college students. So some terms that you may come across, these are things that you want to be looking at, especially that target population. You're doing your literature review and you're looking at previous studies. So these are all terms that we will dive into over the course of the semester. This is very high level look of empirical and non-empirical research and the experimental research, which we'll be doing. And then over the next few weeks, what we'll be doing is breaking this down. So starting with next week, when we talk about sampling, when we talk about what is our target population and how do we create a sample for our studies. So for an experimental research done, how would we do sampling? What kind of sampling would we use? So all of the different research methods that we'll be learning about, we're working backwards from where we want to get to, which is this ability to provide data and science to prove or disprove your hypotheses. So you have come up with your research topics. Many of you have come up with your hypotheses. And so now what we're looking at is, all right, what do we have to do and how are we going to break it down so that you can design a research project to capture or support or disprove your hypotheses. And so this is a summary of the way that we're approaching things. We have our scientific method, the theory, our hypothesis, the empirical methods, the variables, what can be measured and described. When we look at continuous variables and categorical, which we'll also get into. So all of this as it comes together, the definitions. So where for your research right now, your operational definitions, where you're looking at your variables of interest and you want to be able to know exactly how are you going to measure this. So if you're looking at aggression, so you know, okay, this is how I'm defining aggression for my study. How am I going to measure this? How am I going to measure reaction to social media? How am I going to measure if somebody is an influencer or not? So we want to be able to take all of the items that you discussed in your research. Now we're applying operational definitions to them so that you can determine what your variables are, what type of variable they are, and what the manipulations will be and what it will look like to be able to prove or disprove a hypothesis. So the research methods in easy steps. So you're developing a theory based on your observations. Most of you have done this. You're developing your hypothesis. You're designing a research study. This is where we'll stop at this semester at the design of research study. We were going full for the full article that you would gather the data and analyze and report the findings. You want to look into measurements. So validity, does it measure what it's supposed to? Reliability, does it consistently measure those results? So validity and reliability, you want to be looking at for any assessment tool. And then what kind of data collection you would use. Direct observation, questionnaires, interviews. So we've got some of your non-empirical, but looking at your questionnaires of non-experimental or qualitative data or psychological tests, all the different things that we've talked about. These are all data collection techniques. And really what we're trying to focus primarily on is the experimental method. And the reason for that being, it is what we really look to when we look at the scientific method. So it does allow for observation, but it's looking for the changes in the variables and really trying to understand that independent variable in terms of how it's being manipulated, and when something has changed, how does that change our dependent variable? Because that's really what we're doing, is we're tweaking different things, and we're saying, well, what happens if we change social media platforms? And what happens if somebody is cyberbullied more on a daily basis versus a weekly basis? And so this is where we start getting the questions that we're trying to tweak, to understand, to study, to use these research methods to create science. So very dense information this week. That is by nature of the course. The textbook, I hope, does break it down into simpler sections instead of lengthy chapters. But if you have any questions about anything here, please do let me know. And I'm happy to talk through any questions that you have, especially as it applies to your upcoming research projects and papers. So have a good week, and I will talk with you soon.